when ancient democracy took a page out of Game of Thrones. The ancient democracies of Greece and Rome, where the people had a voice and the politicians listened for a little while, at least. The Athenians coined the term democracy and the Romans had a republic, but both fell victim to the age-old political pitfall of the rich and powerful getting a little too greedy for their own good. In Rome, it was like watching Game of Thrones in real life, with elites and oligarchs scheming and maneuvering for power until the republic crumbled into dust and an empire rose from the ashes. Athens had a good run too, until Alexander the Great showed up like a conqueror from another realm and said, "You know that democracy thing you've got going on? Yeah, that's not happening anymore." So, what's the moral of the story? Even the most advanced forms of government are susceptible to corruption and collapse when those in charge forget who they're really serving, the people. In this video, we will delve into the reasons why the ancient democracy failed. Join us as we uncover the factors that led to the downfall of one of the most important political systems in history. When Rome's rich got richer, but the poor were left with nothing but breadcrumbs. Picture this: the elite of ancient Rome are living it up, popping champagne and feasting on exotic delicacies, while the rest of society is barely scraping by. Sound familiar? Back in the day, the economic gap between the haves and the have-nots in Rome was widening faster than a chariot race. Thanks to new riches from conquered lands, the aristocracy was getting richer and richer, while the middle and lower classes were left with fewer resources than a gladiator with a broken sword. It didn't help that the wealthy were gobbling up land left and right, turning small family farms into massive commercial enterprises. And forget about trying to make any changes. Any politician who tried to redistribute wealth was met with resistance that made the Colosseum crowds look like a tea party. It wasn't long before the plebeians of Rome had had enough. Strikes, riots, and protests broke out in the streets, making the city look more like a battlefield than the seat of a once great empire. The moral of the story: if you don't take care of your citizens, they just might give you the thumbs down. When Roman politicians put personal gain over the republic. Picture this: Roman politicians bickering like toddlers fighting over the last fig cake, while the republic falls apart at their feet. It might sound like a bad toga party, but it was all too real in ancient Rome. The problem was factions, groups of politicians who cared more about their own agendas than the health of the republic. These factio, as they were called, were incentivized to create alliances based on legislative aims and personal goals. And just like a game of charades, everyone was trying to guess which faction was pulling the strings. One of the most infamous factions was the Optimates, a group of snooty aristocrats who thought they were better than the commoners. They saw red when regular folks gained a voice through legislative assemblies and were determined to keep them in their place. Of course, the commoners weren't about to let the Optimates have all the fun. They formed their own faction, called the Populares, and appealed directly to the people instead of the Senate. It was like a popularity contest, with politicians vying for the title of most loved by the masses. But in reality, both factions were more concerned with their own careers than with advocating for sustainable change that would benefit all Romans. And so, the republic was left to crumble while politicians fought like gladiators in the arena of politics. The moral of the story: if you want a government that works for the people, don't let the politicians break into factions. Ancient democracies limited voting to select citizens. When it comes to ancient democracies, it seems the concept of one person, one vote was a bit of a pipe dream. Athens, for example, may have been a bustling metropolis, but only a small percentage of the population was actually allowed to participate in the political process. And let's not forget the 150,000 slaves who definitely didn't get a say in anything. Meanwhile, over in Rome, the politicians were playing a game of keep away with citizenship. It was like they were saying, you can pay taxes and fight in our wars, but you can't sit with us. Unsurprisingly, this caused some serious resentment among non-Roman Italians, who eventually rebelled against their overlords. So much for democracy, huh? It turns out that even in the ancient world, politics was all about who you knew and how much power you had, not about fairness or equality. Demagogues were able to easily persuade a misled populace. The ancient world had no shortage of smooth-talking politicians who could convince the masses to do their bidding. In Athens, for example, demagogues Cleon and Alcibiades used their gift of gab to convince the Athenian people to engage in senseless brutality and aggression, all so they could secure power for themselves within the government. And it wasn't just Athens. In Rome, the Gracchi brothers played the populist card to undermine the republic and curry favor with the common people. Not to be outdone, Caesar Augustus swooped in and declared himself emperor when the republic was on its last legs. So next time you're feeling a little too swayed by a charismatic politician, just remember, this has been going on for millennia. Political campaigns were expensive and mired in controversy. Political campaigns back in the day were a costly and controversy-ridden affair. Take the Pontifex Maximus election of 63 BC, for instance. This was a high-stakes political race for the most important figure in ancient Roman religion, the head honcho of the College of Pontiffs, Julius Caesar, who was already a pontifex at the time, decided to run against Catullus, who had more experience in the field. Catullus tried to bribe Caesar with a sweet deal, but the latter refused and instead borrowed an enormous amount of money. He knew that losing the election would mean the end of his career, so he threw everything but the kitchen sink into his campaign. On the day of the election, Caesar reportedly said to his mother, "Mama, today you'll either see your son become Pontifex Maximus or become an exile." Caesar emerged victorious, but not without sparking some suspicion. Historians suggest that he might have lavished electors with a lot of moolah to secure the position. This goes to show that even way back when, political campaigns were plagued with big money and even bigger controversies. Certain individuals had their own personal military. Some ancient leaders didn't just have political power, they had their own personal armies to back them up. Sulla, for example, used his army to eliminate his political enemies and ushered in a wave of authoritarian rule that paved the way for Julius Caesar's ascent to power. Caesar, in turn, formed a three-way alliance with Pompey and Crassus, and with the help of his military campaigns, he gradually consolidated more power for himself. When the Senate demanded he give up his army and return home, Caesar refused and instead marched into Rome with his soldiers at his side. His victory in battle against Pompey cemented his position as the supreme ruler of Rome, at least until his unfortunate encounter with a group of conspirators who decided to stab him in the back, literally. Senators stalled vital legislation with filibusters. The Roman Senate was full of bureaucratic bozos who loved nothing more than to stall vital legislation with endless filibusters. Cato the Younger, a notorious senator and member of the Optimates, was the king of blocking progress with his procedural delays. He was like the grumpy old man who refuses to get out of the way at the grocery store, except instead of blocking the aisle, he was blocking progress for the entire Roman Republic. Cato and his buddies were the ultimate negotiation naysayers, refusing to budge on any changes they didn't like. When a group of businessmen proposed a change to their tax collection contracts, Cato was like, "No way, Jose," and brought the Senate to a standstill for 6 whole months. Talk about stubborn. But Cato didn't stop there. He went on to stymie one piece of legislation after another, making the Senate completely isolated from the Roman people. And it was all because of him and his pesky obstructionist tactics that leaders like Julius Caesar were able to work their way up the ladder of power. Honestly, if Cato had just learned to go with the flow, who knows what could have happened in ancient Rome? Maybe they would have had a better shot at avoiding the fall of the Republic. Senators began using violence to get rid of political adversaries. Roman senators were known for their brutal tactics in politics, including resorting to violence to get rid of their adversaries. In 134 BC, Tiberius Gracchus proposed a land reform bill to help the poor, but the conservative Optimates and many senators believed he wanted to take control of the Republic. They assassinated Tiberius and his younger brother Gaius when he pushed for the same reforms a decade later. This marked the end of political diplomacy and the start of a bloody era in the Roman Republic. Meanwhile, Athenian politicians also had their own twisted ways of getting rid of their enemies. Take the philosopher Socrates, for example. He was forced to drink hemlock because of his association with Alcibiades, and his death remains one of the most infamous examples of political violence in Athenian history. It just goes to show that even the most civilized societies can turn savage when it comes to politics. Participation in long-running wars caused regional instability. Athens had a nasty habit of starting and continuing wars without regard for their citizens or foreign relations. The Peloponnesian War lasted a grueling 3 decades, with leaders like Pericles setting the tone for ongoing conflict against Sparta. Instead of addressing domestic issues, Athens kept pushing their military to the brink, which eventually led to clashes with powerful nations like Macedonia. The result? Regional instability that impacted crucial trade routes and a government that was ultimately sacrificed in pursuit of imperialistic goals. In other words, Athens had a case of war fever that made it both a target and a victim of its own aggression. And there you have it, folks. From the backstabbing of the Roman Senate to the battlefield blunders of Athens, it's clear that democracy has a long and hilarious history of its own. So the next time you're feeling down about the state of politics today, just remember that it could always be worse. At least we're not sacrificing our leaders to the gods or poisoning philosophers. Keep laughing, keep learning, and keep striving for a democracy that's just a little less chaotic than the ones that came before us. Thanks for watching, folks. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you can stay up to date on all the latest political political shenanigans. Who knows, maybe you'll even learn a thing or two. And if you don't, well, at least you'll have something to rant about at your next family dinner.